Hi, I'm Maren. Welcome back to my channel, Maren Makes It. If you're new here, then welcome. If you're a returning viewer, welcome back. Today, I want to help those of you that want to travel full-time while working figure out how to actually make that happen. Like, what does the actual day-to-day reality of working while traveling look like? What does your schedule look like? How do you plan in your time so that you're still getting everything done while enjoying yourself? Because after all, the idea behind traveling while working is not to do it at the expense of your job performance, right? How can you make it work for you? I've spent a year and a half living like this with most of my possessions in a storage unit, traveling full time, and these are the questions that I wish somebody had helped me think through to make that transition to traveling full time a lot less bumpy. If you hear any weird sounds in the background, I am dog sitting for 2 dogs right now and 7 chickens, so you can hear them a little bit possibly in the background. So if you hear weird sounds, that's what's going on here. I came up with 3 S's: scale, setup, and schedule, that I'm going to use to break down all the questions that you need to consider while traveling full time. I also put these in a decision tree for you guys. So first things first, you're going to need a job that you can do remotely to get started doing this. There's lots of remote jobs these days. If you have a job in person currently, see if you can ask your company about taking some time away or taking some time where you do get to work remotely. Alternatively, you can look for a similar position with a company that does something similar to what you do now that is fully remote. I was working as a health coach and doing administrative work online, just to give you an idea of the kind of jobs I had while traveling full time. Okay, so now that you have a job you can do fully remote, let's look at the 3 S's. So the first S is going to be scale. So by scale, I mean scaling up or down the numbers of hours that you work per week. What is the total number of hours that you want to work per week while traveling? Okay, maybe that answer is 0, but realistically, what is the number of hours you need to work per week while traveling? You might no longer have a rent to pay, but there are still going to be other expenses that you maintain from your more stationary, traditional, let's say, lifestyle. For example, your health insurance, your car insurance. Those expenses aren't going away just because you no longer pay rent somewhere. Also, consider what expenses related to traveling are you going to have. This could be anything from using more gas to Airbnbs to campgrounds. Your new traveling life can actually be more expensive than your past life paying rent somewhere, but it also doesn't have to be. So really take a moment and think through these expenses and write them out ahead of time. Me personally, I was working enough on my trip to pay for all my expenses without dipping into savings at all, but I also wanted to balance that with actually feeling like I get to enjoy the places and the people that I'm visiting. Think about it this way. You have 24 hours in the day. You're gonna be asleep for about 8. You're working for about 8 hours a day. 1 hour is spent on things like showering. Let's say that 1 hour is spent eating and acquiring food. 1 hour is spent on chores, paying bills, or other boring adult things that you have to do. If you want to exercise regularly, throw in another hour in there. Now you're already at 20 hours of the day accounted for, which leaves you 4 hours to actually enjoy the place or people that you're with. That's all assuming you're working a 40-hour week, of course. Now, what if we cut back our hours to 30 hours a week? Let's see how that changes things. If you work 30 hours a week instead of 40, you would actually have 6 hours a day with that same breakdown of time to enjoy that place just by cutting back your work hours. Traveling while working feels very different than traveling and being on vacation. That was a huge shock to me when I first started doing this. When you're traveling and you're on vacation, your real life worries just sort of melt away into the background of the beach, or they're swept away in the streets of Manhattan. But traveling while working requires a lot of compartmentalization and planning these parts of your life so that you can still enjoy the places that you're in while not compromising your performance at work or falling behind in any way. The thing to consider here is using time off. So maybe it's not realistic for you to actually scale down to 30 hours a week, but say you've saved up some time off and you want to travel for 4 weeks, let's say. Can you use 1 day off per week to kind of free up some time that way instead? All of this is to say that work-life balance is hard enough already. Now, when you throw in travel, work-life balance, things get a lot more complicated, and having thought this through ahead of time before you're actually doing it will make that transition a lot smoother and will make this process a lot more fun. It will also make you less likely to burn out of this unconventional, more uncertain way of going through the world. So to summarize, I put together a list of questions that I would suggest you go through and answer if you're seriously interested in doing this. So the questions are: what existing expenses will you still have? What new travel expenses will you have? What are your total expenses? Are you planning to take money from savings to do this? Based on your answers for 1 through 4, how much money do you need to be earning while traveling? Number 6, can you scale up or down your number of hours per week? Number 7, how do you want to spend your 24 hours in a day? Number 8, do you have time off you can use? You guys can screenshot this again and just go through these questions on this flowchart and write out your answers to them. I guarantee it will help you think through all of these choices. Before we get to the second S, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button on this video. It really does help YouTube to show this video to other people who might be interested in this content. And without further ado, to the second S. Now, when it comes to setup, we're talking about the physical and technological items that you need to bring with you in order to be able to do your job. First glance, that might seem kind of obvious, like a Wi-Fi, laptop, the things that immediately come to mind, but there might be lots of things that you don't use every day for your job that might still be really important for you to bring along. So for example, for my job, I had a reference manual that I only had as a hard copy. I didn't use it every day, but when I needed it, I really needed it. And that alone made it worth it for me to schlep it along for all the miles and days of traveling. Here's 2 ways that you can approach this packing. So if you look around your home office and think, what does it boil down to? What items in this home office allow me to do my job? Which are essential to my job and which are just for fun? Stuff like the second monitor or the extra speakers you have hooked up, those might be helpful, but are they essential? These are questions to ask yourself. The second approach you can take is for a week, write down every single thing you use for your job as you're using it. Bam, that's your packing list. I recommend a week instead of a single day, since one day might not be representative of your whole job and everything you use in it. But if you're in a time crunch, you could also do this approach for a day or 2. And I think that would still be a worthwhile exercise. For me, this ended up being my laptop, a bag of really just the most essential papers, my iPad, and then a pair of wireless headphones. I kept all of this stuff together in a bag, which was basically my attempt to have work-life separation while traveling, but it also made it a lot easier to just grab that bag if I was gonna go work in a cafe or something, and that way I would know that everything I needed was in that bag. Basically, it's like your little mobile, packed up, pop-up office that you can do. Few other things to consider under setup. So the first question to ask yourself is there anything you're going to need for your job while you're traveling that you didn't need before for your job? So for example, you're going to be working in very different environments than you're used to working in. A home office that's quiet and climate controlled, where you really have a lot of control over the environment around you, is very different than working in crowded cafes, other people's couches, in your car, in a campground. All of these settings are very different. So for example, for me, it was worth it to invest in a really good pair of noise canceling headphones that also had really good speakers built in, because I was no longer going to be taking my calls on speakerphone out loud the way that I normally would have in my office before. Another essential for me was bringing an extension cord with me everywhere I went. That way, if you are in a public place and you cannot get the seat or the table right next to an outlet, you still have a way to be able to plug yourself in and recharge your devices, because keeping your devices recharged can definitely be a constant struggle, especially if you're doing a lot of camping during this time. I would also consider any kind of portable chargers or backup batteries, especially when you have a job that uses a lot of screen time. For example, video calls use a ton of battery life. Any kind of like video stuff, any kind of Zoom meeting, that kind of stuff, all of that drains your battery shockingly quickly, and much more quickly than other stuff just like being on email or just typing. The thing I'll say about extension cords, which is really nice, is that you need only one outlet for your extension cord, but most of the time you'll have, at least 3 spots to plug in on the other side, your side of the extension cord. So it can be also helpful for sharing outlets in public spaces where there might just not be that many outlets. And I've done that before, where I've seen people have fully used all the outlets, and I'll ask somebody sitting next to me, would you mind if I plugged in my extension cord instead? And we both just plugged into there. That way we can both share the electricity and share access to that outlet. So that is another perk of having an extension cord with you. My extension cord that I have is about 10 feet long. I think that's a good distance. Anything bigger starts to turn into like a giant ball to carry with you basically, but I think anything shorter might not be enough in certain situations. If you guys just want to find one super easily, I'll link one down below for you, but I think that's kind of the ideal length to balance between having a giant pile of cords with you and not running into the situation where your cord is ever too short. Thing to consider under setup is basically your connectivity requirements. So how much of your work do you need to be connected to the internet to do? Can any of it be done offline? How fast of a connection do you need? Which is going to be largely based on if you have very large files to be uploading or downloading, especially video files. I would highly suggest signing up for an unlimited data plan during this time, because there are going to be times where you have to work on a hotspot and you can go through data extremely quickly if you're using it not just on your phone, but also for your laptop and your work. I've also been in places where they advertise public Wi-Fi and the Wi-Fi connection is so poor that I end up having to use my hotspot anyways. So in that situation, it's really great to not have to pay attention to how much data you're using. There actually is the cap on unlimited plans, I learned, for data, but it's a very high cap, and unless you're streaming a lot of Netflix on a hotspot, you're not going to hit that cap. You can take it from my personal experience here. The next question around connectivity to ask yourself is, will you have cell service where you're going? I did very successfully do quite a lot of work on mountaintops while I was in remote places. For example, at Mount Rainier, the campgrounds are way at the base of the mountain with no service, but if you drive all the way up to the visitor center, I had full cell service and full data and could easily make a hotspot. Then basically I would just have to race my laptop battery to get work done. That's before I had a car charger for my laptop and a backup battery, which are both very helpful. I will link the car charger that I have in the description down below as well. It's basically a plug that has a regular plug in it that goes in the cigarette lighter, and that's been a game changer in being able to charge devices that don't go into the USB cigarette lighter. And around that, I'll also say, keep in mind, if you have really important calls coming up, like a call with your boss or something that is, high stakes, your job's on the line, you might just want to plan around that call and not risk being in a campground somewhere trying to find service. The added stress of that can ruin your day. And you're trying to be out here enjoying nature and doing your job, making money, and you might end up having both of those things ruined for you by the extra stress added onto your day by something like this. So there are times where you are just going to have to plan your adventuring and exploring around your work. Last thing I'll mention is that there are also Wi-Fi cell service boosting devices that you can install on a car or a van. I don't know a ton about them since I didn't do this, but I do know that these are available. And especially if you're looking to travel while working for a longer term period of time, this might be a really good investment for you. So if we go back to our flow chart here, you can see we've already covered the first two, which are scale and then setup. So this is the list of questions I put together for you guys regarding setup. If you're serious about doing this, I would highly recommend screenshotting this, going through these questions, writing out your answers to them ahead of time as part of your trip preparations. And I'm gonna leave this on the screen for you too if you guys want to screenshot this at the end of the video when I have everything listed here. I think this is gonna be a really helpful chart in helping you work through these questions that you need to get started and in planning your trip. Now we get to our third S, and that is schedule. So I would divide tasks at most jobs into 3 categories: time rigid, time flexible, and time fluid. And I did this to try and help you guys work through how to set up your schedule. So time rigid things are things that take a set amount of time and are at a set hour of the day. So for example, I have a team meeting, it's 1 hour long, and it's always on Monday nights at the same time. It's a set time and it's a set amount of time as well, because it's always an hour. There's no way I can be more productive and it will be less than an hour. It's always 1 hour and it's always at the same time of day. So that is something that is time rigid. The time flexible things are things I know I have to schedule each week and they're going to be a set amount of time, but I have control over when they are. So for example, I have to schedule a 30-minute phone call with each of my clients each week. So it's always going to be 30 minutes. The amount of time is set, but when those calls are during the week is something that I have control over. So this is something that's time flexible. The amount of time is fixed, but when this happens is up to me, and that's something that I can harness when I'm creating my schedule around traveling here. The last category of tasks at most jobs are what I consider time fluid things. So time fluid things are things like writing an email or making a report that can take anywhere from 3 minutes to 3 hours depending on how much time I give them. So you can actually go through your job, write down time fluid, time flexible, and time rigid, and then what things or what components of your job fall into each of these categories. And for everybody, this is going to look a little bit differently because some people's job has a more rigid structure, while some people's job might be almost entirely time fluid tasks. I think as long as your job's remote, you can work around this and make traveling full-time work for you. I think it's really just being aware of the nature of your job and doing this planning that's the most important part. So now once I've kind of written out what tasks are what at my job, my first step would be to get out a calendar and write down anything that's in the time rigid category where it belongs in the week. You can also do this, of course, on an online scheduling thing like Google Calendars, but personally, I like to write it out on paper. Once you've written any time rigid things on your calendar, think about which things are time flexible. So you know how long they're going to take, but you just have to decide where to put them. So for example, I had to check in with each of my clients for a 30-minute phone call every week, but I got to decide when I scheduled these phone calls. So usually I would try to group them together on certain days. And because I knew how many clients I had and how long each phone call was going to be and how long I would like to have between phone calls to take notes and type up any recommendations that I wanted to remember before my next call, I could basically put a block of time in my calendar for that. I would try to group my calls on certain days of the week so that I could plan to have a more exploring day with a lighter workload in between those days. So you can use your time flexible tasks to kind of create a schedule for yourself where you're scheduling in time for driving or traveling or exploring or even just resting, honestly. The time fluid things are a little bit harder to schedule in advance, but giving yourself a certain amount of time every day, perhaps to work on these tasks, that's what I did. So I knew for me, time fluid tasks would mainly consist of scheduling stuff, responding to emails, responding to texts, and those kind of things. I just always gave myself a block of time for that stuff. I also always multiplied that block of time by 2. So if I thought I need a half an hour for that realistically per day, well, usually things take longer than you expect. My half an hour was a very optimistic half hour, so I would give myself an hour instead. And then if I finished early, I was like, yay, I get my time back. But that way I wouldn't be continuously frustrated because things were taking longer than I planned or getting stressed out because I had planned to do this other stuff later in the day and those work tasks were taking me longer in the morning. For my schedule, it generally worked better to work in the morning. I had to check in, log in to my job 6 days a week, including Saturdays. So basically, I would just try to clump my work in the morning as much as possible. That way it was like, it's done, and now I get the rest of the afternoon to chill, and that was my way to compartmentalize things. However, I have met people who travel full-time who have a completely different approach to this because their tasks at their job are mostly time fluid. So they'll have a deadline that's in 2 weeks and it's like, you have to do this project in the next 2 weeks. But there's nobody checking in on them on a daily basis to see, oh, what did you do? What did you do today? And so they would group their work hours completely differently. They would work for like 12 hours a day for 3 days in a row and then have 4 days off in the week, basically, so that they could do 36 hours of work and they would just do these really hardcore days. And then they would have 4 days of complete freedom. I don't think my way or their way is any better. I think it just had to do with the nature of our jobs. What that guy was doing was not possible for my job at all. And what I was doing to him sounded horrible because he was like, I would rather have days where I'm not thinking about my job at all. So really, the main thing is just think this through ahead of time. It will save you a lot of stress. While you're traveling, there's enough stuff coming up at you. Like you have to make a decision about this. You have to make a decision about that. Because your environment is so unstable and there's so much going on around you, you're already making tons of decisions every day. If you can go in with a plan about this, that will make your life a lot easier than if you're still trying to improvise and figure out your schedule as you go on top of everything else. And the last thing I'm going to say is just that nothing here is set in stone. Just because you plan this doesn't mean that it's fixed forever and that's what you have to do the entire time you're traveling. This can continue to evolve as you travel. And for example, in my case, I basically could always just plan about a week at a time from my job. And so I would kind of go through and do what I just talked you guys through 1 week at a time. And that still left a lot of possibility for the road to just take me wherever I wanted to go, but it still allowed me to keep up with my job and feel in control of the situation there as I was going. The last thing I'm going to say too is color coding helps a lot. I think personally writing it down works a lot better too, because the physical act of writing something down makes you more likely to remember on your own. But I do know a lot of people prefer to do an online calendar. Either way, color coding is really helpful. You can color code your job, you can color code, personal stuff, you can color code driving days as something different. You can really use color to your advantage here. Plus, it will make your calendar look very pretty. Anyways, here are the questions for schedule that I put together that you absolutely should be able to answer before you start traveling full time. Anyways, these are the 3 S's around travel that I came up with. Hopefully it makes it easier for you to transition your life from a more stationary lifestyle into traveling more. And let's look one more time at the flow chart that I made. You guys can screenshot this again and just go through these questions on this flow chart and write out your answers to them. I guarantee it will help you think through all of these choices. This flow chart is seriously something I wish I would have had while I was traveling and not something that I would have had to come up with along the way. But if my mistakes helps anybody else with their travels, that makes me a very happy girl. Anyways, I would recommend going through the flow chart, answering all these questions for yourself, and actually writing out the answers to those questions, not just thinking about it in your head. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear how you approach working remotely while traveling, if that's something that you've done. If it's not something you've done, is it something you're interested in? I love to engage in the comments with you guys down below, and I do always take the time to read and respond to everything. Thank you so much for watching. Bye, YouTube.